For nearly 50 years, Sobro has been working to build a better Bronx. From career training and placement, to youth programming and educational opportunities, to affordable housing and commercial development, Sobro has made their commitment to community development their mission statement. When the borough of the Bronx was going through its toughest time in an era of historic disinvestment from government, it was organizations like Sobro that stepped up to serve the community. While the Bronx has turned a page on those times, the mission remains the same. With over 20,000 students served and over 40,000 jobs created or retained in the neighborhood, Sobro is helping build an equitable future. That is why I'm proud to support Sobro and consider them a valuable partner in our efforts to continue growing the Bronx.
Hello, my name is Lourdes Zapata. I've had the great honor to serve for over a year now as the first Latina president and CEO of the South Bronx Overall Economic Development Corporation, commonly known as Sobro, a nonprofit, full-service community development organization which has operated for over 48 years. I want to thank our board of directors, our staff, our community partners, and leaders for the warm and engaging welcome I've received upon my return to my community and to Sobro. When I first stepped into this role, Sobro was facing significant fiscal and programmatic challenges. I'm pleased to report that we've managed a sharp turnaround through fiscal restructuring, re-envisioning and reorganizing the management and staffing of our programs, and we are now in a much stronger position. We've also been leveraging our robust local and regional partnerships to fortify our services to our community. Annually, we serve over 5,500 Bronx and Harlem residents with our comprehensive and innovative approach for preserving and developing quality and sustainable affordable housing, providing critical services for small and minority-owned businesses, and delivering programming for adult and youth education, as well as vocational training and community redevelopment initiatives. We can all attest to this challenging year, which has disproportionately impacted the communities and residents we serve. As New York entered a statewide pause order in March and New York City public schools were closed, Sobro also closed its doors for on-site services. However, we continue to evolve and adapt to ensure that our programs and initiatives remained accessible to those we serve. Sobro was proud to distribute over 40,000 masks to businesses throughout the Bronx, 10,000 sanitizing kits to residents, 300 bags of groceries to our seniors during this time. In September, Sobro's doors reopened and we've prepared ourselves to provide safe, accessible, remote, and in-person services. Our youth and workforce programs are fully operational and ready to support the educational and vocational needs of our students in the Bronx and Harlem. We've increased our services to our struggling small businesses with technical assistance for accessing funding, and we continue to provide safe, sustainable, and affordable housing. As we look to the future, we look forward to partnering in the development of over 450 units of senior housing and homeownership opportunities with great partners like Habitat for Humanity and Monadnock Construction. It's been a challenging yet incredibly rewarding year for me and for all of us, and I truly believe that the best is yet to come. We continue to look ahead to seek out best practices to serve our communities and residents, improve our programs, and make the Bronx a better place to live, thrive, and do business. This year, Sobro has pivoted from our annual in-person gala. We needed to make sure we found the right tone to address our community's needs. As such, we sought to convene important voices for a series of virtual panels to cover critical issues that have emerged because of this pandemic. Our three-part virtual community panel series, entitled Building an Equitable Future, will host conversations with key practitioners, along with government and community thought leaders and influencers, as we discuss the future of our communities and residents. Our focus will be specifically on the current economic and programmatic impacts to supportive housing, youth development, and small businesses, and the upcoming opportunities of providers and advocates. Throughout this series, and as always, Sobro will be focused on addressing the needs of our at-risk communities with our partners and employing all our programs, services, and staff to ensure the long-term viability of our communities. We hope you enjoy our series, learn about issues and innovative solutions, and that you will become a part of our Sobro family, helping us to create opportunities for all New Yorkers. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our third panel in our series, Beyond Bricks and Mortar, Saving At-Risk Populations. This panel focuses on at-risk and/or disenfranchised populations, such as the LGBTQ, differently abled, and special needs communities who face a myriad of challenges which impact their efforts to secure permanent and quality housing. Panelists will frame key issues and innovations in housing and services, as well as outlining priorities to serve these challenged communities. Delilah Tyson, Sobro's Chief Administrative Officer, will moderate this conversation. Here is the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Delilah Tyson, and I'm the Chief Administrative Officer here at Sobro. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon to moderate this important discussion. We're so fortunate to have such great experts in their fields to discuss the critical housing issues facing our at-risk populations and communities. The COVID pandemic has intensified already difficult housing situations for our seniors, disabled, LGBTQ, and other at-risk populations. Our discussion today will outline some of the urgent issues arising from the pandemic, as well as highlight some of the great innovations and new partnerships that have been created to address these concerns. On our panel today are Stacy Bliagos, Esquire, Executive Director, Hannick, Inc., Sean Coleman, Executive Director, Destination Tomorrow, and Allison Zickman, Executive Director of Policy and Rental Assistance, NYC HPD. You can find our panelists' bios on our event platform for your review. Additionally, you'll be able to post questions and comments to our panel by clicking on the Q&A button on the top right corner of this event platform. You may also use the chat function as well. If we're unable to get your questions during our event, we will reach out with answers afterwards. Be sure to stay around after our panel for an important message on how you can help support Sobro's critical work. Before we begin our panel, we wanted to hear from one of Sobro's residents about the issues they have faced and the impact on their life during these challenging times. Here's Cheryl's story.
I've never been without a job. I put myself through school. I have my bachelor's and my master's. But with all of that being said, COVID came and wiped everything away. I am now faced with not having a job. I don't have health insurance right now. And I'm struggling like so many other people that's faced with this pandemic. Everybody is suffering. Fortunately, I'm one of the fortunate ones, I believe, because I have a place like Sobro to come to. I was able to talk to management immediately, state what my situation was, and actually was heard. We're working on a resolution right now to make sure that myself and my 2 children stay afloat. But what does everyone else do who don't have a Sobro or a place to go? So with that being said, I believe that there should be a centralized place where people like myself can kind of go to look for rental assistance, to look for insurance assistance, to look for maybe even mental health. And I'm hopeful that this panel, this discussion brings about services and change that can actually help those who are struggling survive.
Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing such a heartfelt story. I'm not sure about you, but as a Harlem-born and Bronx-raised Latina mother in this community, this story definitely hit home. I can only imagine the challenges and uncertainty Cheryl and so many others are facing during these trying times. So let's get to it. Let's see how our powerful community and panelists can assist in answering some questions to help families just like Cheryl. Welcome and good afternoon, Sean, Stacy, and Allison. Thank you for joining us and participating in this important discussion that can help so many families and organizations that are in need of answers. So let's start off with my first question. I would like you to put yourself in Cheryl's position with your specific professional insights. Allison, I'll start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenges faced by NYC housing residences in our current environment?
Thank you, Delilah. Thanks for having me. I think, as Cheryl indicated, and many people experience, there are a lot of resources to assist New Yorkers for a variety of different needs during, in all times, but especially during the pandemic. But it's really difficult for residents, for tenants, for citizens to understand what they are, how to access them, where to go for help. And because, especially during the pandemic, new resources were developed. For instance, prescription medication was able to be delivered to apartments for people who could not leave their apartments safely. There was a variety of food programs. In the summer, air conditioners delivered to tenants. But I think, as Cheryl indicates, without a community-based organization that someone knows to go to and can help them navigate these different resources, especially as they're being created on the fly, people either don't know or don't know how to access them. So I think what she demonstrates is that community organizations are extremely critical in helping get out the word and helping to connect residents with these much needed resources during this time.
Yes, I agree. I definitely agree, Allison. Those challenges are significant, and we saw them pan out throughout the South Bronx during the pandemic and the pause. Sobro specifically was outreaching with ACs and providing resources on a daily basis. So thank you for that. Stacey, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges?
So thank you very much for having me today. I echo what Allison mentioned there. So I think there are a few issues that come into play when we see Cheryl speaking. First is, I think there needs to be, as much as there are all these programs that exist, information to the community members that these programs exist is a must, because community members can't access these programs if they don't know that they exist. So that's issue one. And it's our jobs as, working for nonprofits and community organizations to get that education out there to all these community members. The second, I think, is when we're talking about access to these resources, yes, these resources exist, but a lot of the vulnerable populations also have limited access to other issues. So for example, when we're talking about housing, in order for someone to apply to for affordable housing, they have to have a computer. They have to know how to navigate housing 2.0, which on one hand, if you teach someone, they'll be able to do it, and it's doable, it's not unreasonable. On the other hand, expecting someone in a vulnerable population to have access to Wi-Fi all the time, or a computer, or even the ability to be quick, because sometimes and this happens to everybody, sometimes you go on a website and it just logs you out accidentally, or something as simple as it happens to all of us. So the frustration that comes when you don't know how to navigate a computer and you're trying to access these resources is certainly an obstacle that exists here. And I echo what the other thing that I do want to point out that the city did during COVID, they've increased all this access to froze rents, and there's an eviction moratorium that existed by the state, which is great. But when someone's really scared and don't have all these other social supports, it's really difficult to access them and to take advantage of them. So when Cheryl is lucky to have Sobro to go to someone to speak to and to address her needs.
Thanks, Allison. Sobro definitely took a stance on doing some electronic blasts. We also did some in-person and outreach over the phone. So because we did understand that challenge. So, I appreciate your answer to that, Allison. And I think we just need to kind of continue to look forward and see how we can continue to provide those resources. So thank you, ladies. So that leads me to my next question. From your perspective, how can organizations, government, and community leaders change the standard model of special needs housing? I mean, is there a population we haven't served yet? And what improvements can increase our scope and flexibility to address the issues we see today? I'll pass that question on to you, Sean.
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for having me this afternoon. I think one thing we can do, organizations, governments, and community leaders, address the fact that the old systems don't necessarily work, right? And in order to get new systems and new innovations in place, you have to bring new blood to the table. Too often when you introduce these new programs, we're introducing them without any kind of community input, right? So they may go to the community board or to maybe a community-based organization that they're familiar with, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're reaching the community population or their target population, right? So I think that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is that we're really not looking at some of the barriers, right? And these are systemic barriers. These are things that we know to be barriers, yet we're not providing sufficient answers to those barriers. I'll give you an example. Here at Destination Tomorrow, what we've decided to do, we've decided a lot, but one of the things we've decided to do is to provide housing, special need housing for trans and gender nonconforming folks who are former or current sex workers who are 25 and over. So right there, we've really teased out the population that were accessing our organizations the most for services around housing, right? And then we went back to the city and said, this need is greater because when you look at LGBT youth housing, there's a pot of money there. It could be larger, but there's a pot of money there. So that need is already being addressed to some degree. When you look at LGBT seniors, that need is being addressed to some degree. When you look at 25 and over, there's nothing available that's around specialized housing for that particular population. So what we wanted to do was create a model. I think the other thing is like, I feel like in ways we're setting folks up, right? We give you housing, but we don't look at those root causes, right, that force folks into homelessness. So if I'm chronically unemployed and I don't teach you how to be employable or help you earn a living wage, then 9 times out of 10, I'm setting you up for failure by putting you in that house or that apartment because you don't know how to sustain it. So I think those are some of the ways that we can begin to address and shift that paradigm a little bit.
That's great, Sean. I firsthand know that population 25 years and older is not being served. SOBRO has been looking at ways and resources to open up that avenue. We assist the workforce career of 24 and over and assisting them to provide them, entry-level resources, but it is important to correlate both. It's important to connect both and to make sure that one totally ties into another, to make sure that we understanding the resource of an employment and how to financial literacy, all those things tie in, especially. So thank you for you and your organization in providing that opportunity. Allison, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
I do. I think traditionally, and especially in New York City, that has, was kind of the founded the model of supportive housing and has such a long history of it. It's really focused on people living with serious mental illness, active substance use disorder, and we've done a great job at serving that population. Of course, we could always do more, but there are populations that I think need to be served, should be served, but maybe the model doesn't fit quite right, especially because, there's so many different eligibility criteria that disqualify people for housing. And so we really need to think, and I'm thinking specifically about those who have a criminal justice history or who are exiting a criminal justice institution where we know that there are a lot of untreated mental health issues there, and people really, for a lot of reasons, need supports when returning to the community. The survivors of domestic violence might not meet the traditional criteria of supportive housing as we have it in New York City. Maybe they don't have the serious mental illness that reaches the clinical criteria, or they may not want to disclose that for fear of their children maybe being removed. I think we know there's a population that cycles between the homeless system and the hospital system, or cannot be discharged from the hospital because they don't have a place to go. But the model we have now doesn't really serve any of those populations well. So I think we need to really think about these other populations and how we fund the services for those, because the services might look a little different for those. And I know that in California, they've done a lot of work with using money from the healthcare system to fund housing and services. And we're trying that here as well to a smaller degree, but thinking about other funding sources than the traditional ones to be able to serve these populations, I think is really critical as we move forward and thinking about special needs housing.
Thanks, Allison. I totally agree. I think that Sobro providing supportive housing services to mentally ill, substance abuse, HIV or AIDS populations, we note that when people do lose their housing, unfortunately, many of their spouses either, again, I'm echoing you, don't want to disclose any ailments and or issues that they may be facing. So a lot of the times, they don't meet the criteria. And unfortunately, Sobro tries to work as best we can with them or any other transitional housing we'll be able to provide. So I appreciate your thoughts on that, Allison. Stacey, what are your thoughts on this?
So I echo what Sean and Delilah, what you said and what Allison said. So I think, in terms of HANIC, when our affordable housing is mostly focused on seniors. And so being in front of the community boards many times, numerous times, one of the things that I've realized is in terms of nonprofits and government and community partners and community leaders, I think the number one thing has to be education to community as a society. All of us have to do a better job in terms of redefining affordable housing and getting rid of the stigma that affordable housing has. Because the moment you go up in front of a community board, some vulnerable populations are acceptable and others aren't. So when we're talking about formerly homeless, you can have a really very adverse community board telling you, no, I don't want this population being served in my neighborhood, right? And then you have other populations that they'll say to you, okay, yeah, we'll accept that. So I think number one is the stigma of affordable housing so that it's acceptable and we should all be able to help our fellow neighbor to find housing. That's number one. Number two, I think my colleagues mentioned it as well, is social supports that exist. So when we're talking about certain populations, such as formerly homeless, and putting in place not just affordable housing, but putting in place social services that will help support those individuals so that whatever the issue was that prohibited that person from maybe finding a job, or they lost a job, what can we do to help them find a job? In terms of seniors, the population for seniors is growing. When I say seniors, I hate using the word seniors. I want to call them older adults. So the older adult population, in terms of the baby boomers, that population is now aging. So we definitely need to look at all these vulnerable populations to see what more we can do. Do we need more affordable housing for those individuals? And then that one size fits all doesn't apply. So you'll have an older adult that is better on Facebook than I am. And then you've got an older adult that doesn't even know how to use a computer. So you have to meet them where they are to help them in terms of whatever they need. And that could be in terms of now COVID, if we're trying to help vulnerable populations and COVID, I personally have tried to get a COVID vaccine for elderly individuals in my family. And unless you're quick on that computer, you're never going to get a vaccine. It's just the vaccine appointments are out. So we have to really look at these vulnerable populations and really evaluate what their needs are and actually put them in place. So it's not just affordable housing on its own, it's affordable housing and social services so that we can ensure their success in society.
Thank you, Stacey. Yes, I agree with you. It's critically important to bridge that gap. We have people walking in from throughout Sobro's portfolio, both supportive housing and affordable housing, that come in day to day requesting those. Do we have a computer lab? Which we do. Also asking, is there anyone that can help them walk them through these process? And now with COVID, the reduction of that availability has impacted greatly. So I think all we can do now is to just continue to bridge that gap. With that said, I'd like to lead into question number 2. Sean, to what extent do improvements in housing depend on us attaining housing equality for at-risk populations? And what resources are currently available for our vulnerable clientele as New York City faces an unprecedented housing crisis?
I don't like housing equality, right? I prefer housing equity. Equality may get me here, equity is going to match me where you are, right? So I'll keep it on the population that I'm most familiar with, the LGBTQ population. There aren't a lot of protections in place right now. There aren't a lot of safe spaces, if you will, that the queer community that finds themselves homeless or displaced can access. While there are some shelters, I think the city needs to do a better job at what transitional housing looks like for our community. And I just want to say really, really quickly, our community intertwines with every community that we just spoke about, right? We're seniors. We may have some issues or challenges regarding our mental health and wellness, underemployment. We fall into all of those baskets. I think the one thing that separates us is being culturally competent enough to provide care or housing, if you will, in a way that is safe and affirming. So I think when we're looking at vulnerable communities, we need to make sure that those housing providers, the biggest housing providers, also understand how to provide services and care for those who identify as LGBTQ. And if they have issues, they can always partner with Destination Tomorrow, right? But I think that begins with relationship building, not just building relationships with other community-based organizations, but building relationships with that core community right there. And I know with Sobro, you guys understand how to provide care and services for LGBT community members, and I commend you for it. But each housing provider needs to do that, right? And then the second thing is, if we're going to house folks in these outside spaces, providers, whatever you want to call them, they have to, at the very least, go through competency trainings that are approved by someone or that community, right? You can't bring in, I'll give you an example. You can't bring in a security team to provide care and service for LGBT shelter and LGBT transitional housing, and they're misgendering folks. They're allowing folks to disrespect each other, and they're making it an unsafe environment, because all of the work that we do as an organization to get that person to housing is all gone now because they don't trust where we've placed them. So it has to begin with vulnerable communities and vulnerable clientele feeling really, really safe and comfortable in the spaces that we recommend and send them to.
Totally agree. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Sean. Allison, any thoughts on this?
This is a big question. And I guess I would preface everything. We need more housing. We need more of every type of housing across the board. While HPD, the mayor's housing plan is to build and preserve 300,000 units of affordable housing, it's never going to be enough, and it's never going to be soon enough. So I think then the issues come to access. And as Stacy mentioned earlier, to access most of HPD's housing, you need to apply through the lottery or Housing Connect rather. And so there's a digital divide there, as we've seen with COVID, access to vaccines and all other services, those without either the technology or the comfort to navigate those can be left behind. I think what we've tried to do is HBD partners with community-based organizations and trains them as housing ambassadors. And so these are groups who we have some specifically for different subpopulations, but then they're just neighborhood-based groups. So someone could go to them and they could walk them through the process, the online process. There are little things, there are certain units that are set aside for those with vision or mobility impairments, but unless you know to kind of check the box, you wouldn't put forward to one of those units. And so going to a housing ambassador with a community-based partner who can really take the time and walk you through it and help explain, make sure you check this box, you might qualify for this, is one thing. So we're trying to expand the housing ambassador program because we recognize these government systems can be intimidating and clunky, and people might have, fear of them, that they might not be eligible or something. So we're really relying on community partners to help access that way. I would say I happen to be co-chair of the New York City Continuum of Care, and we're doing some work to look at for specifically those who are homeless, who gets access to supportive housing and other types of housing? Are there any racial disparities in that? And if so, how do we address them? So I think there's a lot to be done in this front, and we're constantly looking for ways to make sure that the most vulnerable people have access to housing. And I think the community-based organizations are a really critical component to helping partner with government to make sure that happens.
Thanks, Allison. I agree. It's definitely important for the ambassadors that are in place. That's a significant opportunity for them to connect with those that are not able to get those services and those connections. However, it's equally as important to make sure that we know and are aware of what community-based organizations are partnering with the city and offering these services. I think that that's not shared enough within our local communities. Stacey, is there anything you might want to add to that?
Sure. So I echo what Allison mentioned in that there are a lot of these programs. You've got Housing 2.0, you've got your one-shot deal. There's a NYCHA application that you can fill out. I do want to point out that when you go through all of this, the application process is tedious, and you need a housing ambassador. So for in terms of HANIC, we partnered with HPD to be housing ambassadors. And when you're talking to a vulnerable population, you have to walk them through the application. And then you also have to set expectations, which is unfortunate because you're left being the bad guy when really all you want to do is help them, because you have to minimize and say, okay, we're doing this application, but the waiting list could be 10 years. And that person's looking at you like, but you're my last hope. And you know that, and you want to help them, but this is the best you can. So in terms of the lottery, it's there. And as Allison mentioned, you do have to know how to write that application and pick it, and the things you need to pick so that your name can go in. But then there's also the NYCHA list that you might want to go into, and that's probably a 10-year wait. So these resources exist, unfortunately, because so many individuals need them. It's a long waiting list. And I do want to point out with the creation of the MIH program, the city has committed to more affordable housing, but that is also dependent on your medium income level in terms of the household size and what you make. So sometimes the brackets that household meets where you need to apply, you don't fall into it. You're either below that number or you're above that number, and then you still need affordable housing. So I don't want to simplify because it's a very complicated topic, but what Sean mentioned, I think earlier, is having communities at the table to be a part of the process really does make a difference, because then people in a policy-making position really do know how to craft policies and legislation around laws and rules that actually can work for the community.
Thanks so much, Stacey, for that. I agree. It's a time that we just have to make sure that the community understand that they do have a voice, and allowing them to have a voice within organizations as well. Sobro takes that feedback. We do blast, and we like to have that dialogue when they ask the questions and the needs, and we actually appreciate the fact that we're partnering with organizations and making sure that they have the opportunity to partner with others. When Sobro can't provide a service, we need to be able to be in a position that we can direct them in the right area.
But if I can just interject, and
Yep.
I think we all agree here that it's really tough to be a reasonable voice at the table when you're in fight or flight mode, constant fight or flight mode, right? So when COVID's really impacted you, when you have to choose between paying rent and paying for food, when you are in a vulnerable population where the risk of going outside, you could get COVID, and COVID isn't something that, you have people saying, oh, it's nothing. And then you have other people going into the ICU and unfortunately losing their lives. So it's also tough to get a vulnerable population to be at the table to think about really the resources that they need when we're all now in emergency mode. Like, people have lost their jobs. People can't go out. As Miss Cheryl mentioned, like, she lost her job. Like, she needed medical care for her children and her family. she was in complete fight or flight mode. And so if you speak to someone to say, hey, Cheryl, what do you need? That's probably not going to be a good time for her to tell you, because she's really interested in just making it at that point. And we don't want people to just make it. We want people to thrive. I think that's something that we can all agree on, that making and being underwater and making the bare minimum isn't something we're all in the business of doing. We want our communities to thrive and succeed.
Nicely said, Stacey. Thank you for that add-on. So we know some protections are in place, but leave many vulnerable. What opportunities are available to assist tenants and homeowners during this pandemic? Allison, any opportunities come to mind?
Again, I think these are changing by the day almost. And hopefully there'll be another COVID relief bill that includes significant funding for rent arrears and also some support for landlords as well. The state has had rental assistance program. I think, it opened quickly. It has since reopened. I think the city is trying to do some things. So it still seems like it's in flux a little bit. I think anyone who works in this field and anyone who thinks reasonably understands that anywhere, but especially in New York, for people who have lost their income and are behind on rent, and now we're almost coming up on a year. I mean, it's impossible to pay back a year of rent. The amount of money you would have to make to be able to pay your arrears is like, no one makes that much money. And so the eviction moratorium is good. And I hope that for tenants that takes a little bit of the immediate stress off. But I know that people are really still worried. Their rent's accruing, their arrears accruing, and there's hopefully that the government will come through and will be able to assist people with the arrears or assist landlords so that the landlords don't, once the eviction moratoriums eventually are lifted, don't move to evict people, because for the human lives, the toll would be catastrophic. And as a city and a system, we don't want to confront that either. It's not good for anyone. So I think, again, navigating what's available because it's changing so quickly is really difficult for people. And so helping people understand what is available as it's constantly changing is really important. And then helping them connect to what resources might be available to them. And I think the education piece is really important as well. Folks realize that tenants who maybe wouldn't be eligible for other government assistance, hopefully will be included in some way in this. So I'm thinking about undocumented populations who traditionally can't get help from the government, but will they be eligible or will they not be eligible? But we would need to be able to get the word out quickly once it's really clear what is available to people.
Thanks, Allison. Sean, have any take on this?
I do, but it's a switch on your question just a little bit, if I can, right?
Course.
And I think what opportunities exist right now is to kind of dismantle a system that has been oppressive and in some ways racist, right? And redesign what affordable actually is, especially in communities of color in the outer boroughs in New York City. And to Stacey's point, I think it's an excellent opportunity to train those folks that are in fight or flight mode to fight, but then teach them what fighting actually looks like, right? Because we need their voices when we start to dismantle and redesign or restructure what this system is going to look like. It can't come back the way it was. To your point, no one has a year's worth of rent just laying around, and no one's going to give us a year's worth of rent to pay off, right? So we all understand that the system has to be redesigned. In order to redesign it, that means we have to bring landlords to the table as well, and there has to be this kind of agreement, if you will, that the way the system was designed, it wasn't working for everyone. So now what does it look like if we design it differently? And who's going to be instrumental in making sure that we design it differently? So I think the opportunities that exist are for us who are the vulnerable populations and those who provide services for them to kind of begin this discussion to like really restructure what housing in New York City looks like and make sure that those vulnerable communities have a seat at the table as we begin to redesign it.
That's a good take on it, Sean. I appreciate that. This helps us lead us into the third part of this question. So what systems are being devised to address the additional challenges around housing that at-risk populations can face, such as rising housing costs, insufficient income and assets, racial prejudice, inaccessibility related to disability? Stacy, any systems come to mind?
Sure. So, of course, you've got your rental programs, as Allison touched on, which is your SCREEP program and your DREAM program. So they constantly help individuals that need subsidies. HRA offers a lot of benefits. You've got another one-shot deal. So there are systems that already exist that help individuals currently in this particular, in terms of subsidy. I think I do want to sort of point out that allowing individuals to address housing inequality doesn't always come also at just affordable housing. It could be a homeowner that gets help with reducing the electric costs or the heating costs in their home. Or so it's a gamut of programs that could help an individual stay in their home and achieve housing stability. So, and those programs exist, like such as the weatherization, like HANIC has a weatherization program where we do that, where we help individuals look at their windows to see if the windows are okay and there's no air coming in so that they can decrease the cost in heating, et cetera. So those exist, and I'm happy that those exist. But I think, especially now with COVID hitting everybody and hitting the most vulnerable the most, we do need to come to the table, landlords included, as Sean said, to come up with additional needs that exist. Because as both Sean and Allison said, if people had a year's worth of rent, they wouldn't have a problem. We wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's really saying that there are some individuals, and I do want to talk about just really quickly here, that there are people that are professionals that also live from paycheck to paycheck. So if you have a job that you go into work that you're grateful for and you are still living from paycheck to paycheck, imagine a person that doesn't have a living wage job, that lost his or her job, and now what their stress level and what their insecurity looks like. So I just want to point out that if there are people that by all means have graduated college that would not be considered a vulnerable population, that are now need assistance. So you can imagine the severity of what individuals in a vulnerable population are currently in need of. So I think we need to address that in additional subsidies and additional policies, but that will never happen unless they have a seat at the table.
That was some useful information, Stacy. Thank you. Allison, any additional systems you could think of?
I think Sean and Stacy covered it well. We really are in this moment of flux right now, and that it is important, as they've both said, that those who are in need and the people experiencing the worst consequences of this pandemic have input into the policies and to say what they really need.
Thank you, Allison. Appreciate it. So let's move on to question 3. Sean, HUD and other federal partners, including the Department of Health and Human Services, support a national focus on preventing and ending homelessness among LGBTQ youth and ending all forms of discrimination against members of the LGBTQ community in housing and shelter. Programs administered are designed to meet the goal of ensuring decent housing and a suitable living environment for all. What are some financial and programmatic options available to develop not just housing, but supportive programming for this population? Any thoughts?
I think this presents the biggest opportunity to look at root causes, right? Someone mentioned financial literacy earlier. I think that's the one thing in school that we should have gotten more of, right? How to be fiscally responsible, how to manage credit and those kinds of things. I think it's incredibly important to put dollars into those areas. At Destination Tomorrow, our goal is economic empowerment, right? So we're not just going to do an HIV test or refer you for housing, but we're going to make sure that you get something substantial here. So we have a free GED program, a job readiness program, the financial literacy program, professional development program. Money that there needs to be a stronger investment in those types of programs. And we need to make sure that that folks are attending them, right? It's one thing to say that I have this program, but if you have a client who's not accessing the program and therefore they're not getting the end result that we ultimately want, which is long-term sustainability and making sure that their housing secure, then it kind of misses the mark. So maybe some of those programs can become mandatory. But I also want to talk about a system, because one of the things that happens with my community is the misgendering happens a lot, right? And then there are also biases. So while your organization in and of itself may be LGBT affirming, you may have hired someone and you haven't trained them appropriately and they're not. So those biases can come across even in the forms, right? So if I present and I present masculine, but my identity shows a female body or female gender on my identification, therein lies a problem that your client may not know how to get around, right? So making sure that we're working with this universal system that understands those challenges and we know how to work around them so that we can provide services for our clients.
Thanks, Sean. I'm happy to hear that you have some of those financial programmatic options in place. Allison, what options have you observed are being offered?
Well, first, I just want to note that, hopefully this will be changed, but we saw last year HUD tried to revoke the equal access rule, which meant that shelters who receive federal funding could choose to operate. I just want to start by saying that hopefully this will be overturned, but last year HUD was trying to revoke the equal access rule, which would allow emergency shelters that receive federal funding to choose to serve only one gender. In New York City, people who are homeless can choose to go to a shelter that matches their identity with no questions asked. I'm not saying there might not be, it's like the smoothest process, but we really respect people to self-identify and to choose to go into a shelter, whichever they prefer. So the continuum of care and many, many community partners really advocated strongly in the public comments to not allow this, and that people should be able to choose based on how they self-identify where they receive shelter. So I think, and this kind of ties into Sean's last point, I think there's still a lot of advocacy to be done in these areas, and the forms thing it's a real thing. And even, seeing within different HUD programs, since example on the continuum of care side, the way they collect data for many years has had many different options for people to select something that represents how they view themselves. On the Section 8 side, the form said, we recently were able to get this changed, just male and female. And so we know a lot of people, that's not how they identify. They don't want to have to be forced to check one of those boxes. And so I think education is important, and to the point of staff education and training is really, really critical for all of us who work in the human services generally. We need to keep doing that. So that's just kind of a big policy and advocacy piece. In terms of programs, HPD has financed and partnered with a few programs. I think SAGE opened last year, was one of the first programs for seniors who identify as LGBT. And we've also partnered with True Colors, and there are a few programs for youth as well. But I think specialized programs are really important, but I think all programs need to be accepting and accommodating for whoever comes in their door. And that gets back to the training piece and the cultural competency piece for staff and for everyone.
Thanks, Allison. This is all good information. It's important to know that these resources are available. So let's move on to the next question. Most programs are geared toward helping youth develop independent living skills for youth aging out of foster care. Funds allocated allow programs to empower youth to plan for their future and connect them to community supports and resources. But as the pandemic forced most employees to work remotely and put public assistance services on hold, it robbed many foster youths of the preparatory services typically provided within the 6 months before aging out. With this said, what is the current state of affairs and how can we continue to provide the necessary financial and programmatic resources for this population? Allison, what is your take?
I can speak to a few kind of HUD and community programs that I've been involved with. So HUD has had something called the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project for a few years now. New York has applied and we have not received it yet, but we're already preparing to apply again. And it requires very significant leadership and involvement by youth. And so the Continuum of Care, 2 of our steering committee board members are youth, and they represent the Youth Action Board, which is a New York City group, people 25 and under, who the variety of community-based organizations, but really kind of are very important in helping really articulate what the youth want. And that's really important. And so even during the pandemic, we've been preparing and we've been meeting virtually. We've been talking about how to strengthen the youth application. And it's really government, community-based, but very much youth-led. And so talking about different program models that they feel would meet their needs, ways of communicating with youth. They're really pushing us to think more about technology and the way government's always so far behind on technology. And so a flyer or whatever that we might normally do isn't really how a lot of youth consume information. And so how are these messages written, and how can youth learn about resources in a way that they're accustomed to taking in information? So that's been really important work that's been happening. And I think we've been really fortunate in that the pandemic hasn't really slowed it down. So we're really preparing for the next round, and hopefully we will get funding that also includes money to hire youth. We recognize that people that have experience can't just be volunteers, right? We're all kind of paid to do this work, and that we need to compensate people adequately, and we can't just value their voice in non-monetary ways. So thankfully, this allows us to compensate youth as well, this funding opportunity.
Thanks, Allison. Stacey, I want to see what's your intake on this.
We don't really deal with youth aging out of foster care at HANC. That's not normally deal with seniors. We do have youth programs that are in DOE schools. But in terms of youth aging out of foster care, I think these individuals are, as you mentioned, really the 6 months before they're aging out, really that has been stumped by COVID-19, the resources. So I think in general terms, they need support so that they can succeed. I mean, think about you when you were 18. Did you really make the best choices at your age? So understanding what they need and how they need to take it, which is what Allison said, the information that they need to take in, and having a seat at the table. But I think also providing a structure of mentorship, that people that they can turn to for help, because some of these individuals don't have anyone. And so it's important to get them that support and get them someone to be able to talk to, and whatever issue that they may have. That could be from workforce development to what should I do next? But in terms of COVID-19, this is definitely a population that needs more support.
Thank you so much, Stacey. As we know, New York City has been at the forefront of implementing affordable housing initiatives, chiefly by enacting the first tenement law and being the home to the first affordable housing development. What policies do you think are in place to preserve affordability of special housing units? Allison, what policies do you see?
I think from the government perspective, in terms of maintaining affordable housing broadly, a lot of HPD, we're known for kind of building affordable housing, but we preserve a lot of affordable housing too, which means that housing that maybe was built 30 years ago with some government money, and now their regulatory agreement that keeps it affordable is about to end. So we try to kind of re-up with those to make sure that they maintain their affordability. So that's something, and also at the same time, because they're older buildings, then help with some, necessary maintenance and renovations as well, because affordability is one thing, but people need to live there. It needs to be in good condition as well. I think there's also been some programs to outreach to smaller landlords, because if it's a larger company that has a big portfolio, it might be a little bit easier for them to weather the storms, especially right now, right, where landlords aren't able to collect a lot of rent. But a small landlord, if they have one or two buildings or one building with, 8 or 10 apartments, it's much, much harder for those. And those are often places people have lived for years and they're really part of their community. So it's important to outreach to those landlords and help them maintain affordability too. Or maybe they never had government funding, so they didn't have a regulatory agreement to make sure their apartments were affordable, but maybe we could help them do some maintenance and repairs with some government money, and then get them to agree to keep those apartments affordable for longer term. So I think it's really thinking about the different housing stock we have in New York and how to address the big portfolios as well as the smaller landlords as well, because we know that we've lost rent regulated apartments over the last couple decades in New York, and we really can't afford to lose any more. We can build some, but we need to keep the ones that are rent regulated already.
Perfect, Allison. Part 2 of this question asks, what rights and resources do residents have available for affordable housing that can be the difference between chronic housing insecurity and landing in a safe and secure home for the long term? Stacey, I'll let you start.
In terms of the MIH affordable units that currently exist, individuals have to apply on Housing 2.0, and then they get on a waiting list, and then they run the lottery, and the list is made. And so I'm happy to say that those rental units are normally permanently affordable. You just have to meet the AMI income band of your household. So that's the first thing that I just want to mention. The second, in terms of maintaining financial stability and housing stability, there are programs that, as I mentioned, in terms of the SCREEP program and the DREAP program, and actually that goes directly to what Allison mentioned, which is the smaller landlords, because a lot of these individuals that have been in these homes for 30, 40 years, they also are a little nervous to have some of their rent subsidized by the government, because they fear retaliation from the landlord. So educating the landlord about these programs and educating person renting that apartment is also very much something that needs to occur so that individuals take advantage of those programs. But it's important to note that when you're talking about housing stability and these subsidized programs, that could really, in terms of long-term and keeping individuals in their home, that could really make the difference between choosing rent or choosing food for that day, or choosing, a lot of individuals have to go to medical appointments and there's a copay, and what does that look like? And I don't have the money for the copay, so I may not go to the doctor. So it's important to note that if you do not have housing stability, it is a domino effect on every other part of your life that goes from food to medical to everything. So mental health. So it's important that the current programs that I mentioned, they are taught to the community and to landlords, because they both need to know about these programs so they can take advantage of them.
Thanks, Stacey. Allison, can you think of any additional resources?
To what Stacy mentioned, I would say New York has a lot of tenant protections, and not everyone knows what they are. And so making sure that tenants know, especially if you have a rent stabilized lease, you're afforded certain rights under that. And I mean, it's hard for me to understand that lease, quite frankly. So I think helping educate tenants on what their, as they move in someplace, what their rights and responsibilities are, and then what their recourses are. So there are places where someone feels like they're being evicted illegally, or there's a charge that they're being charged something where they shouldn't, how to address that. Also, I think what's really important, Stacy mentioned this, but one of the biggest predictors of who doesn't return to homelessness once they've been housed is it's really the presence of a subsidy. I'm a supportive housing person. I feel that's so valuable. And, the services are important. I'm not saying just give someone a subsidy and put them in housing and forget about it. But we also know that there are sometimes landlords say, I don't take programs, right? And the source of income discrimination. And now it might not be like that tenant might not get that apartment, but it's really important that we help people report those. The city is really trying to take action against those landlords. There are a lot of people with vouchers in hand who are looking for apartments who can't find them. And so some of that has to do with how the vouchers are sized, but some of it is landlords like not wanting to take a rental assistance program, and that's illegal in New York City. And so we have to help our clients and tenants report that, and the city has to enforce it so that people can use their voucher and maintain their stable housing so they can address the other needs that Stacy mentioned.
Thanks, Allison. That's some good information there. I think that brings us to our last question.
Thanks, Delilah. I'm Lourdes Zapata, President and CEO of Sobro, and I've had the opportunity to sit in and listen on this discussion, and these are really critical and important issues for us to discuss, and I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. Clearly, this is a social issue that requires coordinated efforts of government, advocacy organizations, and the private sector as well. And this panel represents some of our best New York City leaders who are responsible for developing and maintaining the city's stock of affordable housing for our disenfranchised populations. The discussion has been super interesting and always educational for me. I love the concept of housing ambassadors that not just work in helping people fill out applications, but really talk to folks and enter into a dialogue with them about what their needs are, even if it is just beyond housing. Working with vulnerable populations clearly is not just about housing, as we have heard. It really talks about comprehensive support that addresses things like food insecurities, medical and mental health, and social supports. The digital divide impacts all of our communities. I think we tend to think about the digital divide in very focused silos, whether we're talking about the elderly or we're talking about folks that are disenfranchised. I think what we've heard today is that it really, we need to start thinking about it much more broadly. And lastly, that serving disenfranchised populations really requires a coordinated effort. We have to give our populations a seat at the table, an opportunity to engage. We have to focus on innovation in providing these services. And in some cases that may mean, I think I heard earlier, dismantling the current system. We need to focus on equity, housing equity, not just housing equality. And we need to focus on innovation and community engagement and discussions and dialogue. So this has really been a provocative, honest, and really realistic discussion on what the issues are that those of us who want to serve these disenfranchised populations, whether we're talking about youth aging out of foster care, folks with medical and mental health issues, members of the LGBT community, seniors, we all have to be brutally honest about where the system is supporting and where it may be failing our populations. So we've talked a lot about our challenges this afternoon, but you are all champions who are promoting the quality and affordability of the city's housing and the strength and diversities of all of our neighborhoods. So I'd like to just end our discussion this afternoon by asking you to tell us how you and the enterprises that you are representing are working to meet these challenges. I think it's certainly, we've explored a lot of where the challenges are, but I'd love to leave our audience with a sense as to where the resources are. So with that, Allison, maybe I can ask you to start.
You know, one of the things we're really blessed with in New York City is that we have so many great community-based organizations who represent every type of individual that lives in New York City. And we have, you know, advocacy groups and really, really a lot of voices to learn from. And so, you know, one of the things that I love best about my job at HPD, while I do work for government, is that we can't do anything without the community groups and then the people we serve. And so really listening to, whether it's through the continuum of care and the people with lived experience who are on our board and who participate in our meetings, you know, what their needs are, but then also hearing from other sectors, populations they serve, and what their needs are. And so I think there's been, I mentioned this at the beginning, a lot of really interesting conversations happening across sectors with nonprofit and government and people lived experience around, you know, what are the needs for folks who have domestic violence past, and also the criminal justice backgrounds. And again, the health piece I think is really fascinating, because I think that's a case where there probably is some money there as well, where we can innovate. And we know our population is aging broadly, and that the health needs and also are important, and some of our housing stock is aging and it's not accessible to people who have disability or mobility impairment. And so like the conversations are happening, and I think the place I love to work is the intersections of these different systems, and we need to really innovate and think about different models of housing. You know, I think we're pretty good. We need more of housing for people with serious mental illness and substance use disorder, but we need to, you know, broaden our toolbox. And I think that it'll be exciting to see who the next mayor is and what their priorities are. But I think there's real opportunity there for community groups and tenant groups and to come together to really voice what the needs of New Yorkers are in this unique moment. And because sometimes they say, right, crisis presents opportunity. And as Sean said, we can't do things the same way. The needs are going to be too great coming out of COVID. And so we need, and I think people have the energy to like innovate, create new models, and really serve all the citizens of New York who need it.
Thank you for that, Allison. I think you're absolutely right. Crisis presents opportunity. I write it down. I think these are all great lessons for all of us. Sean, I know Destination Tomorrow just really does amazing advocacy work for the LGBTQ community. Introduce us a little bit more to your organization and the role that you're playing.
So we wear a lot of hats, right? Destination Tomorrow is the Bronx LGBT Center. So all that means is we provide direct service modeled around economic empowerment. So we just want to make sure we give our community members the tools that they need. And then we've branched out into other things just based on client input. We have a community advisory board and we have a youth advisory board. And based on the input from those two bodies, we've expanded. So now we're also we have a Covert relief fund. We've given away $300,000 so far in partnership with Gilead. So black and brown LGBT-led organizations. We're also a grant manager, again in partnership with Gilead, for specifically trans-led black and brown organizations on a national lens. And they've given us $1 million to re-gift, of which we've already done half. The second phase is coming out in February. And lastly, we do housing, right? And we're new to housing. So, you know, we're the babies in the room oftentimes. And I think that's a good and a bad thing, right? Because it allows us to come in with clear eyes, We don't know some of the mistakes that have happened before, and we're willing to accept any challenge as far as how we restructure what housing looks like. So as I mentioned earlier, we have an emergency housing program. It's a 90-day program. You get an opportunity to stay within our shelter, and you work with your housing manager in order to transition successfully into more permanent housing. I think the largest challenge is going to be, and Allison mentioned it, about those programs that exist that some landlords won't accept. So you couple the fact that some landlords won't accept the program, and we're also dealing with the target population that many don't understand, and we have this compound problem that we have folks with programs and we don't have housing, or we don't have the inventory to kind of match them to the program. To answer that problem, what we've decided to do is we're bidding on some additional units, right? We're looking to find another building. The one we have is 16 units, which means we have 32 beds. We're in talks for a 74 unit studio and 1-bedroom apartments. And the idea is we'll shift our clients from emergency housing straight into transitional living program, that program. What I want folks to understand is, outside of that, we all have to continue this discussion, right? Outside of this panel, I want to make friends with everyone, and I want to be a resource. And only because I see the intersections, and I know others see the intersections, and you may see the intersection and say, how can I solve that problem? And I want you to utilize Destination Tomorrow and my staff here as a resource to figure out how we solve these problems, because we can only solve them together. And then the other thing is, I may present sometimes as the angry one in the room when we're having this discussion around dismantling. And I'm just firm in believing that we cannot build it back the same way that it was. Folks love saying, I can't wait till things go back to normal. For my community, there was no normal. So I want us to figure out what the new normal is for those folks that find themselves at risk, or a marginalized community, if you will, and make sure that we're coming up with innovative solutions that address those core issues that we've discussed today.
Yeah, great, Sean. Thank you for that. What you describe as anger, I describe as passion.
Me too.
And passion is always a good thing from my perspective. And congratulations on your recent initiatives, really great examples of innovation and community engagement. So thank you for your work. Stacey, talk to us about all the amazing.
Attaining started out as a social service organization in 1972. So we definitely have different programs that run the gamut when it comes to youth, adult programs, and senior programs. In terms of what we've done, especially with the last year in terms of COVID, we've definitely advocated for more senior housing, but I think one of the things that we were able to effectively do is, especially in our residents, meet people where they are. So we have 650 units of affordable housing. So we quickly realized that the individuals living in our apartments, although it's independent living, and we understood that, we partnered with World Central Kitchen to get each one of those residents hot food every day throughout the pandemic. So that, because we knew seniors were vulnerable with COVID, so you had seniors that could go out, but they were scared. So we immediately decided to say, okay, what are the needs of our community? What are the needs that we can actually address at this moment? And we did just that. We normally don't provide food, but we partnered with nonprofits that do. So we're able to say that a lot of the residents, all the residents from Corona to a lot of the residents in Queens, all of those residents had food. In terms of our social service programs, it's just advocacy that we're there. We had a lot of our seniors, older adults, not having computers. So we said, okay, how can we get in front of those individuals? And that's through snail mail. It's unfortunate to say, but let's send them information about us. Let's send them about what we do. They don't have internet. What number can they call? What languages do they speak? Because yeah, you might speak English, but you might not have an education where a letter, you don't understand some legal mumbo jumbo. And so you really have to create letters where individuals can actually understand it in different languages. And that runs the gamut. It could be Spanish, it could be Russian, it could be Chinese, it could be many languages, and you have to be prepared for that. So I'm happy to say that we were able to look at the communities that we serve and say, okay, how can we change? What do we need? Because before COVID, as Sean mentioned, there was no normalcy for individuals that he serves before COVID. With seniors, they had a way of life. And so it's also hard for them to change because now all of a sudden they can't see their grandkids or their family members, and sharing a hug might take them to the emergency room. So it's being able to say, okay, what do you need and how can we help? And we did just that. From internet and technology to food, we were able to pivot. But the reason I think we were able to pivot is because we have such a long-standing history. We have been around since 1972, and we are known, especially in Western Queens, so that if you do call up a community member, they probably don't hang up the phone on us. But if you've got somebody that's new to the community and says, well, who are you? I don't understand who you are. I don't trust you. That's still something that community-based organizations still have to get over, because there is a mistrust, especially the last 4 years of government. There was a mistrust, and I'm talking about the federal government, Allison. I'm not talking about the city. There was mistrust, especially individuals of immigrant background. So you get a phone call and all of a sudden it's, what do you want? I'm not picking up the phone. And really all you're doing is trying to help. So education and advocacy that we're doing. And of course, asking what are your needs and seeing how we can help, because that's we exist to help our communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Stacey. I think you're absolutely right. So Sobro is an organization that has served the Bronx since 1972. I think we're sisters in advocacy and service. And I always tell folks, you fall in love with the problem, not the solution. So if the problem is how can we provide comprehensive and adequate resources for whichever population it is that we're talking about. So that's the problem. We need to be nimble enough to figure out what the solutions need to be and make them nimble and flexible and creative and responsive to meet folks exactly where they are. So I think you're absolutely spot on, and you're leaving us in a very good place. This has just been an incredible conversation. I thank you all for your leadership in the city of New York. Sobro is very proud to be a partner. I know we have some projects with Attaining, we have some projects with Destination Tomorrow. So it's not just a question of having good conversation. It really is a question of partnership. And we are very proud to consider you all as partners. And we are most definitely supporters of the work that you were doing. And Allison, the work that you do under the Continuum of Care work, again, a partner and supporter to Sobro, deeply appreciated. Thank you, Sean Coleman, Executive Director of Destination Tomorrow. Thank you, Allison Zickman, Executive Director of Policy and Rental Assistance at HPD. Thank you, Stacey Bliagos, Executive Director of Haddock, for this really impactful conversation. And last but certainly not least, thank you, Delilah Tyson, our Chief Administrative Officer, for leading this discussion and making sure that we are touching upon all the important topics that we need to talk about in service to our community. So this has been an amazing panel. Thank you all very much. You are all officially members of the Sobro family. That is what we tell all of our panelists and everyone that we have the honor and pleasure to work with. So you have all been adopted. Thank you very much. You are our brothers, our sisters, our significant siblings to join us in this effort. Thank you all, and stay well.
Thank you.
You as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope that you have enjoyed watching Sobro's panel discussion today. My name is Prisca Salazar Rodriguez, and I am the director for the New York office at Hilltop Public Solutions, and I also serve on Sobro's board. I would like to thank all of our sponsors for their support today. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them now. Thank you again. I am here today to ask you to consider becoming part of Sobro's giving family. Our work is as critical today as it was when we were founded in 1972. We hope that you will consider becoming an annual supporter. Here is how your dollars will be put in action. A $50 donation will go towards Sobro's Snack Pack program, serving healthy snacks to local youth attending our after-school programs. For many young people, their last meal of the day is the food they receive at Sobro. Your $100 donation will help ensure we secure the additional cleaning and sanitizing products, as well as PPE to keep our kids and staff safe when we are together for our programs. We are continuing to strengthen our virtual programs to ensure ongoing education and engagement for our youth who are learning outside of a classroom setting. Your $250 donation will help support creating content and the necessary internet bandwidth required to keep connected to our youth and keep our program strong. Your annual contribution of $500 will provide Sobro with the necessary funding to provide 10 students with individual counseling, weekly group meetings, career counseling, attendance outreach, and college readiness counseling. A $1,000 donation will ensure that 3 young adults attend our Youth Build program for 1 year, which helps at-risk youth from the ages of 17 to 24 earn their high school diploma and develop the skills and knowledge to obtain industry-recognized job credentials and employment. We hope you will consider one of these options, but every dollar counts during this challenging time. A monthly sustainable donation pledge of just $25 can go a long way to support Sobro's comprehensive programs all year long and make a difference in the lives of our residents. Consider a donation today. You can donate easily by clicking on the donate button on this event platform, or by going to Sobro's website at www.sobro.org and click on donate there. We are so proud of the work that Sobro continues to provide for our communities and residents. Our work is critical in building an equitable future for all New Yorkers. Thanks to all our community leaders for their support. Please consider donating today to help Sobro in their efforts. Thank you all again for participating in the panel today. We hope to see you in person in the near future.